Let's just take a moment and just consider God's presence with us here tonight. Heavenly Father, we're grateful for the times of peace that you grant us in our lives. We're also grateful for all of the great heroes of our faith, the ones we call saints, who not only can they help guide us in terms of the way they live their lives, but also in the fact that they can intercede for us. We ask that you send St. Damien of Moloka'i here today so that we can all learn a little bit more about his extraordinary life and what it takes to be courageous in the face of insurmountable odds. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. So, I don't know if everybody's sitting where there should be a prayer card and other card. Just make sure you get a prayer card if you're not near one. So Saint Damien of Moloka'i, he's a relatively newly canonized saint. He was just canonized in 2009. But he's a pretty powerful guy in terms of the way he lived his life. And I think there's a lot of examples from his life that we can take given our current circumstance in the world and how we approach things. He was born in Belgium in 1840, January 3rd, 1840. He was the seventh of 8 kids. He was born, his name was Jozef de Veuster, Joseph, J-O-Z-E-F, so kind of that German, Flemish spelling of Joseph. But they called him Jeff for short, like Joseph, but they called him Jeff. And he was pretty normal kid. He got into his share of trouble, including him and his buddies used to do a thing where they would try and jump onto moving horse carts. And sometimes, that would get them into trouble. One time he actually got his head run over by the wheels of the cart. And they said he should have died, but the ground must have been soft underneath and he was spared without injury. There was one time when it happened where he fell off the cart, and the guy who was driving the cart knew his parents and says, "I'm going to tell your parents." So he runs off to the church. And he heard that, if you go to the church, it's like sanctuary. And so you can't be touched in the church. And so his parents find him in the church, and they were very devout Catholics, and they would not, other than going in and kind of hissing at him to kind of, "Come on, get out here," type of thing. And he made them promise that they would not punish him if he were to leave the church. And so they got him out of there. I don't know if he actually got punished or not, but he did have a sense of the sanctity of the church, sometimes for the wrong reasons. But just a pretty normal kid. He wound up, he stopped going to school at about age 13 to help out more on the farm. They were a farming family, and so they were kind of in between. They didn't have a lot of money, but they weren't like dirt poor either. He had 2 of his sisters were nuns. There was one that actually went off to be a nun when he was like, I think it said he was like 3 or 4 years old. And about 5 or 6 years later, she died in a typhus outbreak. And so one of her other sisters said that she wanted to go replace the one who had died. And so she did. She went off to the convent, since the one sister had now died, she said, I want us to still have a nun in the family. And that'll be important in a couple minutes. It really made an impression on Joseph. And so he had an older brother named Auguste, who was about 3 to 4 years older than him. And Auguste went off to the seminary to become a priest when Joseph was a teenager. And he took the name Pamphile. So he was an order priest in the Confraternity of the Sacred Heart of Marianne Joseph, Sacred Hearts of Marianne Joseph. And so in those, you typically took a different name, and he took the name Pamphile, and I don't know much about Saint Pamphile, but that's the saint that he wound up with his name. And Jozef, he wound up, he was working in town. He was a pretty strong guy. He was at the point where when he was like 16 years old, he was able to carry 100-kilo bags of wheat on his shoulders, which is about 220 pounds. And he was able to haul these things around. So he was a pretty well-built young man. And people, he was a pretty smart kid, but people didn't necessarily see that right away. They kind of thought he was a little bit, hard to be around. And so when he was about 16, 17, he kind of heard a priest giving a talk, and he really felt a call towards religious life. And he decided he was going to go be of the same order that his brother was. And so he started in with them, but he was not very good at Latin, and so they said, you can join, but as a lay brother. And so he really wanted to be a priest, though. And so his brother would read Latin to him to help teach him Latin. And he was really making good progress with it, so much so that his brother went to the superiors and said, I think it's worth giving him a try. And so they did. And so they let him enter the seminary there as well. And so that was in about 1860. And so again, think of what's going on in the world. That's right around the time of the Civil Wars just beginning in the United States. So he winds up being part of the same order as his brother. And so in 1863, his brother was selected to go on a missionary journey to Hawaii. And a couple weeks before that happened, his brother got sick with typhus. And so remembering how his sister had gone to the convent for his other sister, he said, well, I'm going to do this for Pamphile. And so when Jozef went to the seminary, he took the name of Damien. And he was named after the Damien who we hear about in the Mass. He's in that Litany of Saints. It's in part of the Mass. And so he says, I'm gonna take his place. And so rather than asking his superior, he writes to the bishop and kind of circumvents the chain of command, if you will. And the bishop agrees to it, but his superior finds out about it and goes, next time you need to go through me, because he needs to. The bishop has the overall authority, but you're still supposed to go through the chain of command to do things. And so he sets sail for Hawaii. He's about 23 years old, and he hasn't been ordained yet. And the journey to Hawaii from Belgium, they leave from Germany, they have to go all the way around down the Cape Horn, down in Africa, and then over, past India and all the way over to Hawaii that way. The journey takes 5 months. Okay, so again, 1863, 1864. And he arrives in, I believe it was in March of 1864. And so he meets up with the bishop there, winds up getting ordained in May. And so he's a priest, and so he becomes part of this order. There's order priests there, and this is missionary territory at the time. There wasn't an actual diocese. And it was actually, I believe it was a British protectorate at the time, too. This was not part of the United States yet. And so they're basically going out, and they're trying to preach the gospel to the native Hawaiians. And one of the things that happens when, and they say it was first when the Chinese indentured servants came with some of the British to work the sugar plantations, is they also brought some diseases with them. So they brought like smallpox, typhoid, these other things like that. But one of the things they brought was leprosy. And so these had been unheard of diseases in the islands, and since they had never been exposed to them, a lot of the islanders started getting these diseases and started dying from them, or starting having real problems with them. And so around this time, in about 1865, the government of Hawaii, which was run by King Kamehameha V, he realized that this is going to be a real problem. And so for the lepers, they still really weren't sure how this spread. There's lots of different theories, and some of them were kind of weirder than other ones. But they knew that it was a contagious disease, and so what they decided to do is they decided to exile the people that had confirmed cases of leprosy, or who they thought were lepers. Sometimes they had skin lesions, but it turns out they weren't actually lepers. And so they decided to exile them to one of the islands called Moloka'i, because there was a natural peninsula that stuck out into the water, but then on the main part of the island there was a 3,000-foot cliff that was extraordinarily difficult to get over. And with leprosy, it winds up taking away some of your mobility, and so these people were not going to be able to climb out. And as one of the people said, even if they did climb out, they'd be shot at the top because the order was that they needed to stay in this area. So what would happen is that the natives, native Hawaiians, they were very family oriented, and so what would happen is that the government would come in and basically, if they thought you had leprosy, they would come and they would just take you. They would take children out of the arms of their parents. They would peel mothers away from their children, and they would throw them on a boat, and they would literally take them off to this leper colony, and they didn't even want to land. They literally would throw them into the water and tell them to swim ashore. So it was really, really lousy, and so a lot of them drowned, just on the way to even trying to get to the leper colony. And the original intent was to give them supplies and to give them what they needed so they could have a farming community and to be able to have a decent life. But it never really worked out that way, as we all know. When governments try to do something, they usually do it poorly, and this was no exception to that. And so what would happen is that they were supposed to drop off supplies once or twice a month, and they said they were lucky if they come every other month. And the supplies that they would do, they would throw into the water and they'd wash ashore, and then people would basically scramble to get them and take what they could. And so there were some that had things and some that wouldn't get anything. And so it was really a devolved society that was developing there. And so anyway, so one of the things that some of the missionaries wanted to do is that they wanted to go and they wanted to set up a priest in that area, but they knew that this was a pretty contagious disease. And so Damien had been in Hawaii for about 9 years at this point. He'd been a parish priest at a couple places on the big island of Hawaii. He had been invited to help open a new church on Maui. And again, I don't know how much you guys know which islands are which, but Hawaii is the biggest island down here. And then up in here is Maui is here, Oahu is here. And between Oahu and Maui is this long island kind of like this, and that's Moloka'i. And so when he went to help open this church at Maui, the bishop was there who had been the one who had ordained him. And they basically said, the government has approved us to send some priests to help establish a parish there. So we're not going to force anybody to go, but if there are any volunteers, we certainly would be open to that. And 4 priests stood up. Damien was one of the 4 priests. In fact, it said that he was the first one to stand up. And so what they decided to do is that they were going to rotate them through, and that they would be there for 3 months at a time. They instructed them, don't touch anybody, don't eat anything that you don't prepare yourself, keep your distance, because if you do that, they figured that of all the ways that they thought that this disease could be transferred, by aerosol, by touch. Some even said that it was a secondary result of syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, which is totally untrue. But it also carried a stigma with it too. And so they go, Damien, they said, Damien, you're going to be the first one that goes in. And so as soon as he gets there, all of a sudden the rumors start flying that says basically, they've set up a parish priest and they've set a permanent priest there. And this gets in the newspapers and people are asking, the bishop and the governor of the island, is this really true, or is there a permanent priest there? And he said, well, before he could really answer, it was pretty much, people were figuring that Damien was going to be the one there. And when Damien heard this, he's like, can I? He was like, he wanted to do this. He knew what he was getting himself into, but he wanted to do it anyway. A lot like, remember how we were talking about St. Vincent de Paul last time? And there are people that would just volunteer. We've got this really contagious disease. There's leprosy, or there's the plague. We need help. Okay, yeah, send me. And that's what these priests and that's what Damien were like. They're like, yeah, I'll go. They knew what their job was to do, and their task was not to worry about, I might get sick. Their task was to show the light of Christ to these people. And Damien had a real passion for this. And literally once he got there and he saw the conditions that the lepers were in, there was at this point, there was maybe 700 of them there. And they were, the supplies that were sent were abysmal. They were living in just these makeshift huts that they had made out of sticks and maybe with some branches, and maybe they'd cobble together some lumber and make a few things. They had built a small church dedicated to Saint Philomena, but it was in ruins almost from the moment that they built the thing. It wasn't built that well, and so Damien shows up, and the first thing he does is he goes and he cleans up the church, and he gets it so that he can start saying mass there. And a few people that were there were open to that. There were a lot of people that were pretty belligerent, because what they would do is that these people, they had a death sentence, so they were like, they were gonna live life whatever came at them, and they would make this crude alcohol out of some root that would ferment, and then they drink it and they get drunk, and they'd have, there was like prostitutes and just all sorts of bad stuff going on. And Damien's like, no, this is no way to live. And so what had happened is these people had lost total hope, because they had been sent to this island. They had been basically given nothing, and there was nobody to rule, and it was just kind of just a free-for-all. And so Damien was like the first structure, and he just showed them Christ and who he was. And he didn't ram it down their throats, although there were times when he would go into some of these brothels and he would take the young women out of there, and he would take the children out and he would protect them, and he would do different things that way. I mean, he would do that, and he would stand up to some of these people. But in general, he just loved them. And so if there was people that were dying, and he would go and he would change their bandages, so he would touch them, and he would feed them, because part of leprosy is sometimes that the nerve endings die, and then you injure your fingers and things to the point where the joints just fall off. And so a lot of people, you'll see these kind of hands that look like this, because everything's just kind of fallen off. Or it's become so infected it falls off or has to be amputated. I mean, it's really a disfiguring disease. And so, again, there was a movie that I watched, Damien of Moloka'i, and it's really well done. It's from 1999. I put it in the liked videos on our YouTube page so that people could. It's in a playlist called Saint Resources or something like that. It's a free movie on YouTube. I had seen it before, but it's just a really good movie. It shows you Damien's heart. But there's scenes in there of him just caring for people. And if they're dying, he would have their head on his shoulder, and he would just nurse them, and he would just be with them. And the people saw this, and they realized that this man was there to love them. And so he showed them Christ's love through his actions. And so he just did it. And so people then started getting a little bit of hope. And so when they finally were able to get some supplies, because he would write these letters, he would write letters to his brother, and his brother, because he was trying to get his brother, you should come over here. You should do this with me. We should, because they were like 3 years apart in age. They wanted to be priests together. And his brother wound up getting a job in a seminary or something, and he got a little comfortable. He eventually did go over for a couple of years in the 1890s, but after Damien had died, but he didn't stay long because of his health. But his brother would publish these in the newsletter of the order, and the word was getting out, like from there to get to the newspapers. It was getting all over Europe about these conditions, and people started, being outraged about this. What are you doing? How could you let these people live like this? They would start sending money. Well, then the church officials on that end and the government started intercepting that, and they were, well, we need the money here. Even though they really needed it in Moloka'i, in the leper camp, they were intercepting it, and they're using it for other things. So Damien was able to get some materials, and they were able to fix up the church. They were able to build some small huts. There were some people that started earmarking their money and said, this money is only for the use at the colony, to be used as Damien sees fit, as Father Damien sees fit. And so conditions started improving, and there was a picture that I saw that because they couldn't grab tools, what they would do is they would take a hammer and they would tie it to their arm, and then they would be able to hammer because they couldn't grip the hammer, and they would be able to use tools that way. And Damien, like I said, he was this really strong guy. He would climb this 3,000-foot cliff in like an hour. Somebody had done it in 2 or 3 hours, so he did it in an hour. He just was really super fit. And so he would be like, scurrying up onto the roof and repairing the roof and doing these different things. And people were just like, this guy's doing this for us. And so it gave them hope, and they would then help as much as they possibly could. Even though it was very limited, things started improving. And so in 1881, so he had been there at this point for about 7 years, Princess Lily, I don't know, she's got a really long Hawaiian name. She was the princess, and she decided she was going to go visit the leper colony. And so she does, and she was absolutely appalled. So she was a Hawaiian by birth, but she visits this leper colony. She's just totally appalled. I mean, she was just visibly shaken, and she started, they started, sending money and resources, not everything that they needed, but Damien had to kind of fight tooth and nail for this. And he got a reputation as being a pretty disagreeable guy, but it's because he was like so adamant about this. Look, we need this. And they would say, Damien's exaggerating the conditions over there. And then people would go over there and like, no, he's not exaggerating the conditions. It's worse than what he says. And so he would do all the jobs that needed to be done, including burying the dead. And so what they used to do with the dead is they would either dig a really shallow grave, because that's all they could do, and bury them, and then like wild pigs would come and dig them up and eat the bodies, or they would just take them over to the cliff and dump them over the cliff, and then wild dogs and wild pigs would eat the bodies down at the bottom of the thing. They didn't know what to do. So he made a real effort to dig graves, build caskets, and bury the bodies. And they said at one point he was burying 190 to 200 people a year. Because again, the average life expectancy for the people that once they were on this island was about 4 or 5 years. And he was there for a total of 16 years. So do the math. There's an area at the site now where there's a ton of unmarked graves, because in the 40s, a tidal wave came through and basically wiped out most of the buildings and most of the grave markers and all that type of thing. So right now, when you look at the site online, there's just this gigantic open grass area surrounded by a stone wall, and it's all full of graves, and it's an enormous area. And Damien buried most of those people. People would help him as much as possible. But so if you have to bury 200 people a year, probably every other day he's doing a funeral, digging a grave, and building a casket and burying a body. So conditions, that starts to wear on you. And for Damien, he had two things that he really struggled with. One is that he joined order priests because he wanted the companionship of his brother priests, and he didn't have that, okay, because they weren't going to send more than one there at a time. I don't know whatever really happened to those other 3 priests, why they didn't like rotate those guys in, but they didn't. But his other struggle is that the infrequency of when he could go to confession. And he just was like, I need somebody to hear my confession, or I'm going to go to Honolulu and have them hear my confession. And they were like, well, you've been at the leper colony, you can't come, but he'd go anyway. He's like, I need to go to confession. Well, at one point, the bishop, they said it was the order priest, or it was the bishop, came to hear his confession, but the people that were running, the captain of the ship, would not let the bishop off the ship. He said, if you get off the ship, you stay off the ship. And he wouldn't let Damien come on. Damien had taken a boat out to the ship, and he says, he's not coming on here either. And so basically Damien had to do his confession from the little boat to the big boat, and he did it in French. And the bishop knew French as well, so he did his confession in French. He's screaming his confession from the little boat to the big boat just so he could receive the sacrament. He said what he would do is that he would say his confession to the Blessed Sacrament in his church too. It's not the same, but he did as much as he could to try and keep sacramentally sound. And so he was a real cause for change in this area. And so much so he showed them how to build roads, and so he showed them how to blast rocks so they could make a nice road between where the port town was and where they were on the other side of this peninsula. And there was a small, I think the hospital's over at the other one, I can't remember now, But they built a church at the other one as well. So there was a church at both, that he served both churches, and he would go back and forth on the peninsula to serve at both churches. And, you know, for years it was like, no, I don't have leprosy. You know, I mean, it's a grace given me by God that I have not gotten it. Well, eventually he does show some signs of contracting leprosy. And upon further examination, it turns out he winds up with the worst form of leprosy. And so he realized that this was a cross that he was going to have to bear, and he bore it. And he said, you know, I'm doing this for the glory of God. So what would happen is that he noticed in his numbness in his foot. When they went to examine his foot, they stuck a needle in and gave him an electric shock in his foot and didn't even feel it, which is typical, is that you lose all feeling in your extremities. And so he wound up just, the disease started progressing, and over a period of about 4 or 5 years, it started taking hold. But one of the things that he had been asking for, he's like, we just need more help here. Right? I need nuns. I need nuns who are nurses to come here and help, especially in the hospital. And they're like, you know, we're not going to send nuns because they're going to get sick. And he says, you know, I need another priest. I need to be able to have somebody hear my confession. And occasionally they would send another priest. And the priest there was twice, I think, they sent another priest, and after a short time, the priest would leave. He just couldn't take it anymore, and so he left. But he just kept praying. He just kept praying as much as he possibly could. But he started a choir in the church, and in the movie, he does a really nice job of this. I mean, they're terrible singers, but they had a band, and so they would have like this orchestra, and they somehow got instruments, and they were all players, and he would just make the mass as joyful as possibly could be to give these people hope. And it worked. I mean, they had to add out of the church a couple of times because there were so many people coming to Mass. At one point, they said there was 1,000 people in the colony, and over 600 of them were either Catholic or converted to Catholicism because of him. And the ones that weren't were you know, they certainly had their lives changed as well. So I don't have my notes with me, so I don't know. It was in 1883 or 84. That a man named, it was 85, excuse me, because he had his conversion in 83. A man named Ira Dutton arrived on the scene, and he was an American, and he was a Civil War veteran, and he was a war hero. And actually, if I remember right, he served in one of the Wisconsin regiments as well. And he heard about this place, and he wanted to go over there. Now, he had a really rough time. Right after the war, he got married. The woman was a spendthrift, and she just spent all his money and then left with another man. He turned to alcoholism, and after about 15 years of this, he finally just said no more. And he just went cold turkey, and he stopped drinking, and he had a life conversion and went to live in a monastery. They said they would have ordained him, but he had heard about this place and realized that he could go there and do penance. And so he got permission to go. He shows up, and the diocese says, yeah, you can do it. And he shows up specifically to help Father Damien. And he is really good at culinary, and he can cleanliness, and so he helps really clean up a lot of things there, and he becomes Father Damien's right-hand man. In the meantime, he continues to pray, and he hears that there are 6 nuns that are shipped to Hawaii from Syracuse, New York, and they arrive in 1883. But the governor and then the bishop, they don't want to send the nuns because they're like, we forbid you to go because we don't want you to get sick. And the nuns are like, well, we want to go help. And they just wouldn't let them do it. So they set up another hospital, one in Oahu and one in Maui. And these nuns did it. And there was the nun that was leading the order was Sister Marianne Cope. And she was a very kindred spirit to Damien. She was very determined about what she was going to do. And she knew eventually she would go there. Well, as Father Damien started getting sicker and sicker, and after Ira Dutton, who took the name Jozef, he wasn't a religious, but took the name Jozef, and Father Damien called him Brother Jozef, a very devout man, and he gave him news that it sounded like they were going to send the nuns. And they sent the nuns in late 1888. And this is when the disease was pretty advanced with Father Damien. And Sister Marianne comes and she sees that she had been lied to for 5 years about the conditions. They said the conditions are much worse than he's making, or the conditions are much better than he's making it out to be. And she's like, no, they're worse. And he had made improvements, and she still was appalled at the conditions. Once the princess had been there earlier, she actually was able to get them to get beds there for the people in the hospital, because they were just laying on the floor in the hospital. That's all they had. And so it's slowly improvements had been made. But Sister Marianne, there was a really good scene in the movie, and again, maybe there's some artistic license, but she's with Father Damien on his deathbed, and she's like, we didn't know. We wanted to come, and they told us that we weren't needed, but if I would have known it was this bad, we would have come sooner. And she's like, please forgive me, even though it wasn't her fault. But he's like, no, this has been the answer to my prayers. He goes, I know that my work will carry on now. And these 6 nursing nuns, they just walk in and they just start doing what they do best, and they just really helped build this the cleanliness of the hospital and serving the lepers, and things really started to change at that point in time. But on Monday of Holy Week in 1889, April 15th, Father Damien is on his deathbed, and he basically says, I know I will be spending Easter in heaven this year. I'm looking forward to spending Easter in heaven. And he dies that day at the age of 49. But when you see pictures of him, he looks like he's about 109 because the disease just ravaged his body. And so because his personality, some people who didn't like him thought he was a difficult person, it really prolonged his case for canonization. And so this Sister Marianne and this Jozef, brother Jozef Dutton, the point I want to make is that saints and holiness attract other saints. And so another saint that was attracted to Damien was Mother Teresa. And Mother Teresa was working with her lepers, and in 1984 she writes John Paul II and said, there's no patron for leprosy, and we need a patron saint for leprosy, and I think it should be Father Damien. So Mother Teresa is pushing for Father Damien's canonization. He was, I think he was made a blessed sometime around then, but the saints saw this holiness. Marianne Cope was made a saint in 2015, and his brother Jozef, his case for canonization is open now. So the holiness that Damien exhibited attracted the attention of other people and made them saints. And so that's why it's so important, these saint stories that we're telling. For those of you that are preparing to get confirmed, find the right confirmation saint, because that saint can help bring you to sainthood. Okay, so saints tend to, Mother Teresa and John Paul II, both of them, they were like best friends. Saints don't make it to heaven by themselves, and they bring others with them. And so I would just encourage you to get to know Father Damien. He's the patron saint of AIDS and HIV patients, because of when he was canonized, lepers, and he's unofficially something else. It is unofficially the HIV and AIDS victims, but leprosy and outcasts is what he's also patron saint for. But he was just a super hardworking, just wanted to show the light of Christ through everything that he did, and was just a great example to a lot of people. Any questions? Claire?
When you said he was able to scale the cliff in like an hour, does that mean he was like going outside of the cliff? Like you said, they would shoot people who did that, right?
Yeah, well, they would. I mean, somehow he would do it. I mean, there were stories of him when he was in Hawaii, to get from one village to the next, he would scale like 2 or 3 mountains, and it was this sharp volcanic rock, and he would like tear up his shoes and all this kind of stuff. So he just was like this mountain man kind of guy. So he made it to the top and back, and they said he would do it as often as he could.
To like go where, like?
To do it, just to kind of, probably to burn off stress and energy.
Okay.
Yeah. And now you can there is a trail that takes you down. You take it by mule, and I saw some video of it. I'm like, no. It's like this down the side of a 3,000 foot thing. Yeah, no. Anybody else? The mystery of the rosary that we're covering with Damien is the ascension of Jesus into heaven. We're into the glorious mysteries, and the fruit of the mystery for that is hope. And you can try and bring faith to a people, but one thing Damien did is he had to instill hope in them first, and he showed them that through Christ. And so, you could sit here and you could tell them the truth about Jesus all day long, but if you don't instill some sort of hope in them that life has a chance of getting better, they're not gonna take your word for it. And so that's what he was able to do through his example, and he would show them that, hey, we can work and do this. There was another thing that they did is they actually wound up cultivating sweet potatoes, and they'd sell them back to the mainland so they could earn money to buy things. They were afraid to touch the people, but they weren't afraid to touch the potatoes that the people had made, that they had grown. But he gave them hope. And I think that's the thing that is the most lacking in society right now. I think, as a couple of you were asking your petitions about despair and anxiety, that's the loss of hope. And so I think sometimes we just have to try and maybe we got to say it to ourselves 100 times, or maybe we got to find all those citations in the Bible that say, do not be afraid. But at some point we have to find some hope, or have somebody show us some hope. And my prayer for you is that in the life of Damien, and I would encourage you to watch this movie, but I would also encourage you, I had a little book that I promptly lost, which was a really good book on him. It was in the library here. It was just a little 64-page book on him. But he just had a tenacity about him that just, a determination that you just knew that anything was possible. He would work from sunup till midnight, and he would tend to so many things. It was almost like there was 5 of them, but there wasn't. He just worked hard, and he just kept his faith, and he lit people up because they were able to get a little bit of hope, and that got them to be able to do things that previously they weren't able to do. And like the church attendance was just crazy how many people were coming to church after that, and that's because he gave them hope. And so try to find the sources of hope in your life, of true hope, not false hope in earthly things, and that type of thing, but the hope that Christ brings, whether it's spending time here in the church, or whether that's in time with the Word, or just in time with prayer, but something to try and bolster our hope, because I think that's, once we lose hope, then lots of other things get lost too. So I think that's the first thing that we all have to do, no matter where we are, is to try to gain some hope back. And through the lives of saints like Saint Damien, it's possible to do that.